Well, folks, I think we're going to get started here with our panel. So this is everybody. We hope you guys have come here this evening ready to have a little fun, because we plan on this being a fun night. I drove 5 hours from Yellowstone, so we came out here to see some interesting dialogue, and hopefully we can create something very inspiring here this evening. I think that's the beauty of this film we saw. Hopefully folks were inspired by that film. I'm sure some people liked a lot of what they saw. Some folks may have had some issues with some of it, but the beauty of this forum here is the opportunity to create a very civil dialogue, one that I hope develops a sense of pride in the people in this room here today, this evening, in regards to what it means to call ourselves citizens of the Northern Rockies, to be ambassadors of a place that still has wolves, grizzly bears, bison, and some of the critters that make this one of the most unique places in North America. I want to welcome everybody here to the panel. It's an honor to be your moderator here this evening. My name is Michael Leach. I'm formerly an interpretive ranger in Yellowstone National Park, where I worked for 8 years. Graduated from the University of Montana, the Environmental Studies Department back in 2005, and went from there into a bear education position with the Park Service. So I traveled the park as one of the bear spokespersons, trying to spread the love for bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and really trying to create that more inspiring dialogue in regards to what it means to live with grizzly bears. Another certainly keystone species and a great predator we have here in the Northern Rockies. I left the Park Service in the fall of 2007, refinanced my house right before the beginning of this financial crisis, and made the decision to start a nonprofit organization from scratch. So I'll tell you in about a year whether I'm bankrupt. I'm getting close. But the organization is called Yellowstone Country Guardians, working to inspire local communities to nurture the wildness and spirit of Yellowstone Country. And we'll be giving a presentation called The Wildness and Spirit of Yellowstone Country here with the Montana Natural History Center in November. And we'd certainly love to see some of you folks. I definitely want to give a special shout out to two people in particular. One, Tom Woodbury. Is Tom in here? Tom is the executive director of the Western Watersheds Project based here in Montana. This has traditionally been an Idaho-based organization. They opened up an office here in Missoula. When, Tom?
I'm the Montana director. I think the executive director would probably not.
Well, the director here in Montana. And
we opened a year ago.
A year ago, and I'm really excited about that. This is an organization that has certainly made great strides over the years throughout the region. It's great to have an office here, and Tom is a great ambassador, so I highly encourage you folks who are here in Missoula to look up Tom. And we've got to give a real special shout out to Jerry Black. Jerry, none of this would have happened here this evening without Jerry. If you don't know Jerry, you need to get to know Jerry. Jerry's going to be the mayor here one of these days in Missoula. Jerry's the man. So we want to thank you, Jerry, and thank you very much, Western Watersheds and Mr. Woodbury, for having us here this evening. With that said, I'm going to get into introducing our panel. And I also want to ask you folks to send some love to Gardner. I'm the head boys basketball coach at the high school, and I lost 5 of my 7 starters this year. And being the head coach in Gardner is not easy. And so if you can send some love our way, we'd appreciate it very much. With that, I'm going to introduce the panel members, bring them up. We're very excited about the panel we have here this evening. I want to give a special thanks to all of you for coming here tonight. I think that this forum is going to be full of great dialogue, very inspiring, as long as you guys have brought some good questions and are ready to participate here. So let's start with Renee Van Camp. Renee, if you want to come on up. Renee is the former wolf coordinator for the Alliance for the Wild Rockies. Mr. Mark Hebblewhite. Mark Hebblewhite is the assistant professor of ungulate habitat ecology in the College of Forestry and Conservation at the University of Montana, and much of his research has emphasized predator-prey relations, and in particular wolf-elk dynamics. So you'll definitely be able to give us some knowledge here this evening. Carolyn Syme. Carolyn Syme, it's a pleasure to have Carolyn here this evening. Carolyn graduated with a degree in fish and wildlife management from, of all places, Montana State University. So we'll overlook that.
Oh, that other place.
She is currently the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Park Wolf Program Coordinator. Welcome, Carolyn, here. Becky Weed. Becky Weed made a long haul. Becky Weed made a long haul across I-90 here from Belgrade. She's the owner of the 13-mile lamb and wool company in Belgrade. She is raising Montana State Department of Agriculture certified organic lamb while maintaining a predator-friendly operation. And last, but certainly not least, Nathan Barley. Nathan Barley is... Mr. Barley is a long-time Gardner resident. He's a Gardner and Mammoth Hot Springs native, has a long history in the Yellowstone ecosystem. He's a professional wildlife guide, a hunter, a wolf ecologist, and the founder of the Wild Side. The Wild Side, which emphasizes leading single and multi-day excursions, programs for a number of different group activities, focused on viewing wolves in Yellowstone while exploring the wonders of our world's first national park. So that's our panel. I'm going to start off here with a question. And with that, I hope you folks are ready to get this thing going, because we got some great people here on this panel this evening. So thank you again, everybody, for taking the time to be here. Let's start with one for Nathan here. As a native of Yellowstone country and a business owner leading wildlife safaris into the nation's first national park, how have you, Nathan, witnessed personally the return of the wolf impacting visitors' experience in Yellowstone?
Great. Well, it's a good question just because I feel like the film demonstrated the idea of an ecological transformation in the landscape and its wildlife, but there really has been quite a change in the tourism in Yellowstone Park. The visitation to the park really has been increasing, particularly in recent years, and we'll probably break another record for park visitation this year. But within that, there is kind of a special subculture of tourists and visitors. People call them wolf watchers, wolfers. There's all kinds of little nicknames for who they are, but they're people that are coming for the express reason of trying to view wolves in the wild. And perhaps Yellowstone now has become the place, the best place perhaps in all the world to actually do that. The road access and the ability to look over miles and miles of country with spotting scopes, binoculars, that kind of thing actually makes this sort of rare, elusive predator a little more accessible, and it is possible to see them. So our business, particularly in the last 5 years, and even longer since wolves were first hit the ground in '95, has really increased just because of the great interest that the tourists are showing to seeing wolves. So maybe I'd just like to end that up with the University of Montana study that looked into this particular aspect of tourism. It was an economic study done by John Duffield. And his estimate was that $35 million was being generated annually to the region because of the wolf being back and that being an extra draw for people to visit Yellowstone Park.
Have any takers in the audience here? Does anybody like to get this started with a question to our panel? Yes, sir.
Sure. Since the Grimm's Brothers fairy tales many years ago, wolves have received a huge amount of bad PR. Now, I've also read that it's authenticated that there's never been a case on record of a wolf in the wilds attacking a human being. Is that true?
No.
In North America. In North America.
Well, I would even say no to that, depending on who you ask. So in answer to that, in about, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, there's a case, Valgeist is prominently sort of involved with it, and a couple other colleagues of mine of a mine worker in northern Ontario, or sorry, northern Saskatchewan at a uranium mine in the winter, who decided instead of, they basically drive back and forth in buses back and forth from the mine and the work site, and he decided to run back to the work site, or back to the home site from the mine at night, and was, lo and behold, found killed and eaten by wolves. And it's a bit contentious, it's certainly a bit disputed. It could have been Black Barrel at the time of year was really tough, this and that, and you know, either way, the wolf, I think the salient point is the wolf was habituated to the dump associated with the mine. And so, you know, the sort of question about whether it was wild comes into question. But it's certainly, I think it's more important really to look at the reason why that's sort of trotted out as a justification for living with wolves, right? We live with lots of other things that kill us, and you know, we do things like mountain bike and break bones and die in those kinds of ways. So it's really kind of, I think, more important to really address why is that particular statistic important from a social viewpoint, because it comes up touted in the opposite. Actually, if you go further afield, and many of the people who know anything about Val know his current cottage industry is sort of talking a lot about the sort of role of wolves killing humans in Russia. And there's other parts of the world where wolves do kill a lot of people. For example, in northern India, where one township of a particular poor region of northern India, where about 500 people have been killed by a wolf over the last 20 years. When you dig into the sort of history of that particular area, it turns out that lots of them are young children, and there's a sex ratio bias against young women being killed by wolves. So you know, I think the sort of, you know, you could find statistics to point here, I think, around different parts of the world, in Russia, in the great wars of Central Europe in the sort of 16th, 17th, 18th century. There's lots of stories authenticated by historians of wolves eating and attacking humans. And really, I think the bigger question is, well, it's kind of surprising they don't, right? I mean, they're big, they've got teeth, they do it a lot. So, you know, so all of those statistics aside, I would ask a question back, why is that always trotted out as a justification? It's always been a question for me, I'm not sure.
It does seem that throughout the efforts to reintroduce wolves in the education and outreach period, that was trotted out by wolf supporters as, you know, almost a sounding board in terms of the lack of human encounters in relation to death between wolves and humans in North America. And I definitely think that's you made a very important point there. And next question. Yes, sir.
I watched a presentation with Doug Smith last year, and he had commented on his opinion of the delisting of the wolf. And in his opinion, he was for delisting because, you guys might be familiar with Doug. I don't know if his opinion has changed since then, but his reasoning was that in 1995, when they reintroduced the wolf, they had made a promise to the public to control the population when they saw the population fit to sustain itself, and so it was a promise that he felt needed to be kept by the government in order to keep that public trust. So maybe Carolyn, maybe you might be able to comment on that, or anybody else.
So the question.
Okay, question, Mike. Okay.
Do we think Doug's a great guy? We think Doug's a great
I like
guy.
that.
We all think Doug's a great guy.
I'm sorry. So the question was, is it the right time to delist wolves?
So, I guess my question would be, is it the right time? What would be your answer against his opinion? And specifically, do you think that pledge should be honored or not?
Carolyn, would you like to start
Sure.
with that?
First, I'll say thank you for the question. I appreciate the dialogue that we're having tonight about this very central question of wolf recovery and agreements that were made along the way about what constituted recovery, what constituted a recovered population, and what happens to them afterwards. Speaking from Montana's perspective, criteria were established. There was a lot of public comment. There was a lot of scientific thought that went into establishing the criteria at the time. And decisions were made commitments were made, if you will. There are laws that guide how those decisions are made. And at the time, there came to be an understanding about what constituted recovery, and decisions were made based on that. And so we can fast forward and look at the last 20 years of wolf recovery as being largely successful. And it's proceeded faster than maybe perhaps we as a human species were ready for that to happen. From Montana's perspective, we think wolves are recovered from a biological point of view, and we think it is appropriate to delist them and transition them to a state-based conservation and management program. There are a lot of concerns out there about how states will manage wolves, or how, how that's going to proceed from here forward. And there's concerns that maybe there isn't a legal safety net or a professional safety net, if you will, and I can respect that people may think that's not adequate. I guess I would invite you to participate at the state level and help us manage and conserve a species that lots of people care about, but that is very, very controversial.
Could I just add just a little bit more to that? Montana's plan is probably the best out there, and I personally believe that the wolves in Montana are at a recovered level, and they have met the criteria that was set many, many years ago. The problem being is that the Northern Rocky Mountain wolves were listed as a population, a 3-state population: Montana, Idaho, Wyoming. And though the necessary regulations are in place in Idaho and Montana as far as with keeping a healthy recovery level once they're delisted, they're not there for Wyoming. And actually, Yellowstone actually had a 28% decrease in population last year, because it's becoming an island population, because the connectivity that needs to happen in a population is being shrouded by things around Yellowstone, or the fact that if Idaho, Montana wolves are delisted and they don't have the same protections, then what happens to this little island population in Wyoming? The problem is that Wyoming doesn't have an approved management plan because they didn't have acceptable regulations in place last go around when they tried to delist. So it's kind of a catch-22. It's unfortunate that, yes, Montana has worked really hard to craft this plan that I feel would most likely keep a recovered population, at those levels, but our very next door neighbor has not crafted that plan, and these guys were listed as a population, not as a species. And so this population needs to be protected, not just state by state. So that's kind of where the issue is right now. And the fact that, Montana did have an increase of 18% in their wolf population from last year. That everybody says that's great, and it is great, but it's only 30, the year before it was 34% of an increase. So we've already dropped half of that. So they're already filling niches, and they need to move. They need to have connectivity to be genetic diversity to happen. So that's why Wyoming is a problem right now with the whole delisting. So long answer short, do I think delisting should happen? If Wyoming could get on board with a plan that didn't have the predator zone in 85% of the state, absolutely, I really do. But without that, I don't think we're ready. So that's my opinion.
Becky, would you like to follow up on that?
Yeah, just to answer your initial question, as far as I know, Doug Smith does still support delisting. You could confirm that or not. And in answer to your other question about the pledge and the understanding of what the target was, yes, there really was an understanding in much of the Montana population about what the target was. And the fact that we now seem to be dealing with a moving target has done unbelievable damage to the credibility of the environmental community. And it's also left state and federal officials getting shoved around every which way. Serious people continue to disagree on what that target ought to be numerically, but I'm pretty darn certain that the current what I call a circus over delisting, it is not at all clear to me that it's helping wolves. And it's clear to me that it's creating havoc in other areas. But really more important than that numerical target issue to me is something larger. I mean, I think we will continue to sort of be learning as we go and figure out not only what's biologically necessary, but what society can tolerate. And by society, I don't mean just ranchers. But more important to me is there was a really important backstory to a couple scenes in that movie, which aren't clear probably to a lot of people. But Mike Stevens, the guy who manages Lava Lake Ranch, who has been unbelievably creative in working on these coexistence tools and trials, he's a former Nature Conservancy field biologist who grew up in Spain and is fluent in Spanish and therefore communicates really effectively with 15 Peruvian sheep herders. And when the guy who owned that ranch pieced together some former large sheep ranches in Idaho, Mike was a genius of a diplomat and also a very smart biologist. He kept on the older ranchers and had really good relationships with them, learned a lot from them, continues to learn from them, even though some of these guys are well into their 80s. And by being incredibly careful in his local culture, but also documenting stuff scientifically, monitoring their grazing lands, all these details, putting together a conservation and science board, he led by example. And if it wasn't for Mike Stevens, I bet my bottom dollar that John Faulkner would not have been in this film. I mean, 20 years ago when I started, or not 20, whatever it was, when Predator Friendly got started in 1994-5, the then district ranger in Ketchum called me up and asked me to come talk to a group of people in Haley, and this was long before Mike Stevens was there, and I didn't know what I was getting into. I didn't know anything. And I talked to several of these old sheep ranchers who later ended up being the people who sold to Lava Lake, and they were about as hostile to predators as anybody can be. But it's been this long period of evolution of people learning on the ground, and Mike Stevens did not go stick his finger in people's eye and tell them how evil they were and that their motives were bad and that they didn't care about their land and that they were trashing their streams, even though in some individual cases some of those things might have been true. And in fact, he was the recipient of lawsuits from some environmental groups who said he shouldn't be on public lands or private lands for that matter. But through careful work and careful science, he just basically has been leading by example. And I'm sorry to take so long, but I think, to me, this is the overwhelming message of where we are right now. The only way we're going to move forward in a way that can celebrate the beauty of what we just saw in this film is if we learn on the ground. And you don't learn on the ground by telling people they're assholes, basically. And even if the plaintiffs on the delisting lawsuit get everything they want next week from Judge Malloy, where does that leave us? We still have this challenge of figuring out how do we coexist with wolves. And even if we have all these successful islands like Yellowstone, well, we all know from conservation biology they will be islands unless we learn how to live in the landscape between the islands. So I feel like there's just huge potential, and there are people in Montana, Seth Wilson is in the audience amongst them, who are doing some really nuts and bolts things to try to live with wolves, but those people need our help, not our condemnations. And I would even go so far as to say that, 5 years from now, if the current hype really gets out of control and the anger levels in both the ranching and hunting communities continue to escalate as they are now, I will look back and ask myself very seriously, do the plaintiffs on this lawsuit bear some responsibility for the deterioration rather than the improvement of wolf status in North America?
Tom.
As one of the plaintiffs in the litigation, I'd like to kind of follow up on that and express, my heartfelt concern in relation to what we saw here tonight. And that has to do with the striking contrast between the attitudes of hunters, ranchers, and wolf managers in Minnesota and their counterparts here in Montana and Idaho. And what is amazing to me is that even though you have, you know, sort of elders there in Minnesota who've been living with wolves all this time and have pretty good attitudes and relationships worked out, their wolf managers are committed to, there's not this assumption that as soon as it's delisted, God darn it, we're going to get out there and start killing these things. That seems to be the attitude in Idaho and Montana. It's like the whole point of delisting is so that we can start killing them. And not to celebrate that, oh, we're working cooperatively and living with wolves. And so my question is really kind of directed more to Carolyn, and that is, you know, I haven't seen the leadership from the wildlife managers in these two states to do public education and outreach and really make sure that hunters don't think that the wolves are the reason they're not getting their elk, and, you know, really taking the time to involve all elements and all segments of the population to be sure that we have recovery, not just in populations, but in relationships between people and wolves and wildlife. And so I haven't seen that, and so maybe I'm missing something, but what is, you know, the amount of your budget and your time that is devoted to public education and outreach, and why isn't Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks sponsoring events like this? I mean, I totally appreciate you being here, because, you know, I think that shows, you know, that you do care about public education and outreach and this kind of dialogue. But why do we have to invite Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to an event like this? Why aren't you guys the ones that are out there and leading this and going into these communities where there's all this hatred and all this misinformation and doing that kind of outreach, engaging attitudes and waiting until the attitudes have changed before implementing a controlled hunt?
Caroline.
Wow.
They're calling you.
I heard some opinions and I heard lots of questions in there. And so I heard a little bit about where does our budget go? How are we funded? How do we prioritize our funding? Right now, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is entirely federally funded.
For wolves.
For wolves. And I would be the first one to say that our funding is inadequate at this stage of where we are with wolf recovery and transitioning management to states. Right now, our funding covers myself, 5 people at the field level, 2 half-time seasonal technicians, some volunteers, and we are running at about $600,000 per year. Is that adequate? No. Is there more that needs to be done? Absolutely, there's more that needs to be done. We need to understand more about the relationship between wolves and livestock to see if we can get ahead of that curve. We need to understand more about the relationships between wolves and the natural stuff that they kill and eat. That would help us be better managers. And certainly there's a lot more work that needs to be done in the public outreach sector. So what I will take away from your comments is that you'd like to see us do more.
Carolyn, what would a intensive education and outreach program look like to you? If you could wave that magic funding wand and be able to get out there with a strong, intensive education and outreach program, what do you see would be most effective here in Montana?
I think there's a couple of different ways to look at it. One is we can put all the facts out there that we want to put out there. And humans are humans, and we have value systems, and we filter information day in and day out. And we also have tendencies to selectively listen and agree with what happens to fit our value system. And so if the question really is about our values and how we're going to reconcile different value systems about this species, that's one day at a time. That's one day at a time, problem solving, day in and day out. That's time, that's not money, that's people.
Mark?
If we want to talk about facts, then we can talk about facts. You know, I don't know if any of you have been to the Fish, Wildlife and Parks Wolf webpage. That webpage gets about 8,000 to 9,000 hits per month.
I think I might chime in here that the assumption that the difference between Minnesota and here is because of education is sort of unfounded, actually, and I don't think that Minnesota put any more money into it than FWP or any other agency did. But to me, the big difference, and I've worked on wolves in Mongolia, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, China a bit, all through Canada. I'm Canadian, I'll say A in a minute and you'll kind of get a picture. You know, in 5 to 6 provinces in Canada. And I mean, I think one of the differences, the key difference, is time. As Carolyn said, this is a tolerance issue. And I think like the movie, one of the key messages I took home from the movie and the comments, I think your comments were right on about the sort of experiences in Idaho is, I mean, it's a shock to the system when wolves come back to a sort of either a hunting-based management system or a livestock production management system that isn't used to them. And people respond in very natural human ways to, you know, threats and changes to their normal day of business. Like, you know, the construction by the El Diablo. I mean, it was terrible all summer. We had to bike around instead of, you know, going straight to El Diablo to get our burritos. I mean, business went down for at least a month in El Diablo because nobody knew how to get into it. But people adapted and they got used to it. Right? And you know, it sounds like a bit of a trivial story, but I think education, and I think Carolyn hit it on the head, this is a sort of conflict of values in many ways, and they're a conflict between, I view it as two different ways of thinking. People that value the sort of utilitarian aspects of nature, or people who value the utilitarian aspects, I mean in terms of production of elk and things like that, and people who value the utilitarian aspect of wolves. The movie we saw today sort of, you know, points out that there's a utility to having wolves in an ecosystem. They grow birds and they grow aspen and beavers and stuff like that. But fundamentally, there's nothing necessarily inherently better in some ways. That's an intrinsic value of wolves. And I think moving away from the sort of, you know, externalities of different value systems that have different interpretations of utilitarian values of wolves or of elk or whatever, and sort of moving towards an intrinsic value of nature, expressed very nicely by the ranchers who summed it up, I think, in the best line in the movie. I love seeing the wolves at my picture window, but it's annoying, right? And so I think that to me summarizes, you know, where, you know, I think the tolerance issue comes with time, you know, and I don't think there's any way around it. And in terms of outreach and public outreach, I mean, I don't do any of the sort of, I don't do that much livestock wolf conflict work, but my start on it in Alberta started where wolves killed $60,000 worth of llamas, 3 of them, right? So there's these prize llamas in this typical llama trophy thing, or, you know, pyramid scheme. And it was really sort of, well, you have to wonder. I mean, I hope there's no llama farmers here, but I've insulted you all right now. But I mean, it really was exactly that way. We went from day 1 to being chased off the property almost with guns to day, you know, 300 when they were going to Arizona for the winter as snowbirds, which is what Canadians do. And they leave winter if you have enough money. And then we were staying at their house. And I think that, you know, in terms of outreach, if you call outreach, you know, taking your version of the world and going to Hamilton and telling people in Hamilton or the good dumb people of Cody, Wyoming, what all the cool things about wolves are, and I say that for a reason because that's what Defenders has done in the past, then I say that's not really outrage. If you say instead having people standing on top of a dead, you know, livestock killed by wolves, like we saw in the movie, talking about solutions, I call that effective outreach, and that is a war of attrition in some ways.
And I'll just add something to that. I mean, I outreach for my profession, for my job. I teach people, you know, I teach coexistence. And I do think that understanding hardships and the fact that there are people on both sides of the issue, clearly on the wolf delisting and just the whole reintroduction, and respecting both sides of the issue, but also providing facts and evidence to say that, yeah, there are hardships. Obviously, nobody is negating that fact, but are the hardships really that bad? I mean, really that bad? I mean, a few of the statistics in the 3-state region, wolves have killed 214 cattle out of over 6 million. Is it really that bad? 355 sheep out of over 900,000. Now, because of those kills, there's 20% of the wolf population was management killed last year. 20%. You know? I mean, it's not that bad. 2% of all cattle killed by all predators were killed by wolves. 2%, 7% by sheep. So it's really not that bad. It's a hot issue when, like south of Dillon, when you have 120 sheep killed, which I have questions about that. I agree with that. That's huge. Or $60,000 worth of llamas, even if it was 3. That is huge. I mean, that is huge, you know? But is it really that bad? I call it put it in perspective. Get the facts. It's easy to get the facts, put percentages out there, start talking to people about, you know, we understand your hardships, but, you know, there's compensations out there. You know, there's both sides of the fence for defenders, but in 2008, defenders put out over $226,000 for compensation. Since 1987, they've made millions of dollars of compensation payments. So is it really that bad? I don't think it's really that bad. And going back to a very early question about has there ever been a human killed by a wolf? I mean, why is it that big of a deal for wolves? I mean, people get killed by bears. People get killed by dogs. People get killed by swans. But why is it so big of a deal that when there's, even in the Northern Rockies region, there's 1,600 wolves here. Why would it be a huge deal if one killed a person? You know, so it's not that big of a deal, I don't think.
Oh,
Dr.
dear.
Blatt. Dr. Blatt.
It was part of our litigators' question that wasn't answered. And if there's a problem with outreach, there's a problem with money, funding, etc., then why the rush to kill the wolves? Minnesota said, we're going to back off for 5 years. Why are we starting a wolf hunt September 15th? I mean, why not back off until we study these issues? And we can come together, and we can have groups like this get together and talk about it. Or is this because, basically, there's pressure from the same people who want to keep bison in jail down in Yellowstone National Park, basically the livestock industry? Or, I mean, what is the answer to that? Why the rush to kill them?
Mark or Carolyn? Nathan? Anybody want to?
Sure, I'll take it. I think it was meant for me, right, Mayor Black? I'm going to call you that from now on. Yeah, so why hunt? Why the rush to hunt? I think that's a fair question. I mean, there's lots of different value systems, lots of different preferences about hunting. People support hunting, people oppose hunting. But at the very end of the day, when I go home, I'm thinking about how you conserve and manage a population in balance with its habitat. And the movie was very clear about also including humans as a part of wolf habitat. And Montana has lots of room for wolves. We've got lots of room for livestock. We got lots of room for people. We got lots of room for deer and elk. But we have modified the environment to the point where you can't have unlimited numbers of everything everywhere. Ranchers know this. They carefully manage their pastures and their forage. Wildlife managers try to carefully manage wildlife in keeping with its habitat. And now that we have wolves in the system, they too need to be managed. And fair chase hunting is one way to do that. An alternative is aerial gunning by federal agencies, which some would also find distasteful. So trying to balance numbers and distribution of wildlife in keeping with its habitat. That's why, and that's why now. We're there.
Yeah, I have a comment that's related to both of those questions. You know, early on in the movie, they quoted a guy from the Aldo Leopold Foundation saying, I think he said, people didn't think about food webs and things like that before 1927. I dare say there's some indigenous populations of people who would question that statement.
So I think that was going to be one of my main comments about the movie, in fact, is can people and predators coexist? I suppose the presumption of that title indicates that humans aren't predators. And I would say that, you know, to the answer of the last missing carnivore in Yellowstone National Park, about which, I mean, this is just one view of it, but it's a very sort of interesting line of thought to take. The last remaining predator that isn't there is humans, right? Native American hunters dominated the ecosystems. The journals of Lewis and Clark tell stories about the only places they saw wildlife were in the war zones between the Blackfoot and Shoshone nations in the eastern plains of Montana and the Dakotas. The third biggest city in 1492 in the world was Mexico City. There was anywhere from 10 to 25 to 40, 50 million Native Americans in North America at the time. So, the question can, predators and humans coexist? I would say, the answer to the question, why hunt now? And I'm not a hunter really in any really way, shape, or form. I studied wolves for 15 years. I know wolves on a personal level that display more personality than half the people I know. So, I really enjoy wolves and love everything about them. But I suppose, from when I put my science hat on, the answer to the question, why hunt wolves now? I guess, in ethics and sort of, in philosophy, we think of an argument and what makes a good argument. And a good argument is one that can be posited and not reversed by just simply reversing the argument. So I would ask the question back to you, well, why not? Right? And so I think it sort of begs the question, if the answer to that argument is only a value or sort of ethical one, that I don't like wolf hunting, I don't like hunting, I think hunting's dumb, or some detail like that, or I hate wolves and I hate the boat they came in on, I wish we could send them back to Canada, blah, 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 and we hear all that kind of stuff. If those two arguments are absolutely reversed, you have the same question. And so there's really, in that way, I think it's very difficult to use facts to answer that question. So, that's just sort of one sort of perspective on why hunt now, in some ways, why not? So,
To follow up on where I was going at that point, so in 1927, we started thinking about that stuff, and the pendulum has swung in another direction. And, in our typical Western European arrogance, we had a bunch of scientists say, wolves are really important. And they are, but isn't it equally arrogant to say, okay, now we know what's right, we're not going to kill any wolves anymore? It just doesn't fit with where we are as a species on the planet. And I think part of the reason why there is this bitterness, it isn't only about 1% or 7% losses, which sometimes it's catastrophic, sometimes it's not. It's true the losses in and of themselves aren't going to destroy the universe. And so we should be asking, why is it that ranchers are so upset about wolves if it's really not that big of a deal? And I think part of the reason is that they see a society that sort of whipsaws us with these pendulum swings. And so why not have a hunt? What's the panic about the hunt? We can have mechanisms in place that monitor the hunt, that keep track of the totals. I'd say rather than get really panicked about a hunt, let's have the best damn hunt we can and make sure it's a responsible one. And keep it extremely limited if that's appropriate.
Yeah.
I'm the vice president of Montana Cattlemen's Association, and I've had some encounters with wolves up on our place. They've gone ahead last year and cost us about $25,000. 40 of our cows came in open. We had 3 confirmed killed livestock.
Can you speak up, please?
One thing that there's a huge misconception about ranchers, and I saw it there, is that we want to kill all the predators. We want to damage all the wildlife we can. That's not true. When I go for a ride in the morning or in the afternoon, or when I go ahead and I take my kids out, I enjoy seeing a lot of wildlife. We see elk, we see deer, we see moose. And you know what? For some weird reason, we do have aspen trees there. I know that Carolyn probably does a very, very good job with her outreach. There has to be an interest for her to outreach to. And Becky, my hat's off to Becky. Becky sat on the board of livestock, and she was a predator-friendly outfit. Okay, now that gained her a lot of popularity, let me tell you. But talking to Becky and her ideas and her thoughts on management were really important. What you guys are seeing here, sir, your comments about everybody wanting to go ahead and kill the wolves.
Not everybody.
For heaven's sakes, sir, I think you're wrong. You know, a lot of times when hunting tags get sold, you know where that money goes to? It goes to conservation. You know, it goes for more research and more studying and taking better care of some of these animals. You know, and I don't know. I came here tonight to this movie to visit with a couple of my friends. Me and Mr. Hellwhite. I went ahead and I did a little ad in the Missoulian on June 28th. And what I did was I took ranchers all across the state and some of their wolf kills and what it cost them to have these animals back running loose in our areas. In our area, they were only endangered. We've always had wolves there, you know. We didn't have the 4 packs that we do now, you know, and that's pretty scary. Elk, you don't see very many elk anymore. The deer, you used to have all these mule deer around, and we live on a reservation, guys, they don't get hunted. You know, they're gone too. You know, there's slide marks across the road every once in a while, you'll go across and see a blood spot. But we know that the wolves are here to stay. You know, but what we want is we want a healthy population. You know, and you guys can go ahead and bear that in mind with the hunting season. You know, have a little compassion towards ranchers, because ranchers are the people who go ahead and have all these wild open spaces. In our wolf kills, we didn't have any on public land. They were all right there on the place. We got a whole bunch of wolves right on our place. We didn't want them there, but they're there.
Ma'am, what's your name?
Kim Baker.
Kim, I want to thank you for your testimony here, and I want to say I think if there's one thing to take away from that, I think that word compassion is very important. I mean, we do look at the figures of wolf kills throughout the state of Montana, and to many people it doesn't seem very significant, but to individual ranchers it certainly can be significant. I think that compassion is a very important part on our end as conservationists. With that said, I would like to direct a question to Becky here. We saw in that film how we as humans can coexist with predators, with animals like wolves, in an increasingly human-dominated world. But my question for you would be, give me some examples of what you do on your ranch to nurture both a working landscape and a wild landscape. Because I think one thing that's important that was brought up here was that I think there's a direct tie between a working landscape and a wild landscape in Montana. So if you could give us an example or two of what you're doing to be a more predator-friendly operation, I think we'd
Well,
enjoy hearing that.
first to clarify a couple of things, I'm temporarily out of the sheep business. Hopefully that's not permanent, but although we still have livestock on the ranch that I don't own at the moment. But anyway, that's beside the point. There are a bunch of things that we've learned, and I can talk a bit about that, but with the caveat that we're a small operation in the Gallatin Valley, and the woman, Janet McNally, that they showed from northern Minnesota had even fewer sheep than I did, and she's got about 13 guard dogs, and she breeds guard dogs. So, you know, it's really, really interesting to listen to the Minnesota story, and I'm sure we can learn a lot from it, but it's quite different from the landscape we're in, so just keep that in mind. Anyway, the whole business with learning to live with carnivores in agriculture, it's kind of fascinating, and if it wasn't so costly, it would be downright fun. But sort of the take-home message for me after doing it for 20 years, and every year is different, is that adaptation is the name of the game. And you could argue that's the same lesson we have to learn whether we're dealing with wolves or climate change or anything else. We need resilience, and you only get that from learning. But there's all sorts of stupid little things. You know, I pee in the back corner to mark my territory. Somebody told me once that we had a lot of trouble with foxes one year, and we put mothballs in at the doors of their dens, and that seemed to help, although I can't prove it. A lot of it, I think, I should also add, we actually don't have wolves. We have mountain lions, occasionally black bears, coyotes, and foxes, and occasionally domestic dogs. irregular, unpredictable human presence was extremely helpful. One time we had a 3-legged coyote that was hanging around and we shot over its head to scare it, and that seemed to make an effect.
Cell phone crime.
Yeah, by us all very.
No, I turned
So there's a whole bunch of little things that we
Hey,
learned.
Tom, can you come get her?
Yeah, escort out.
It's okay. I mean, so I teach at the university. I have to do that in the middle of lectures.
There's a whole bunch of little things that we learned, but frankly, it was a whole lot easier to commit to learning them because I wanted to from the get-go. I mean, we just made this decision, my husband and I, that if we had to kill native species, we weren't sure we should be ranching. But also acknowledging right from the get-go that it's a lot easier for us than it is for, say, Kim or a whole bunch of other people. And, you know, my name is known because of this predator-friendly label, but I think it's as interesting not only as a way to educate the consumer about how cool wolves are, but also to educate the consumer about how difficult sustainable agriculture is. And so, you know, I'm happy to share whatever little tiny tidbits I learned about, but at this stage of the game, watching what I see in the newspapers every week, I'm actually focused on something different. I feel like 10, 15 years ago, whatever it was, when the conservation community had this movement to reintroduce wolves, there's a lot of really good things about it that I agree with, but I don't think they fully articulated a vision for what this is supposed to look like 30, 40 years down the road. And a lot of people I know in agencies and NGOs have gotten kind of burned out on the wolf controversy, so they're doing something else now, because it's pretty tough. I think Carolyn should probably get a Purple Heart for all the abuse she takes. So now it's kind of incumbent upon all of us, conservationists, ranchers, whatever, to sort of figure it out. And I don't think that's going to happen in the courtroom.
Let's see. Let's get a quick test.
Yeah, my name is Seth Wilson. I'm a conservation biologist. I coordinate the wildlife committee for the Blackwood Challenge, which is a landowner-driven group just up the way here. I'm also a postdoctoral researcher at the Yale School of Forestry. I guess I just had lots of questions come up, but maybe Carolyn, so this film talks a lot about the positive functional role that wolves play in the ecosystem, particularly, you know, with the highlight of the parks. When you look down the future of management, how much of the landscape, and you alluded to this a little earlier, you know, certain places may be more suited or less suited to having wolves and people share the landscape. But I guess I'm curious about, can we achieve this notion of more resilient ecosystems that actually might benefit the ranching community and folks who live on the landscape and the critters in the ecosystems too? But can you think a little bit or tell us what your future thoughts are on where that spatial distribution lies and where we can achieve some of that cascading impacts in Montana? Does that make sense?
It does. I think it could potentially be a work in progress, as we've talked about, one day at a time. I'm not sure that any of us know exactly how the story's going to end. You know, the experiment has begun, reintroduction has begun. I think the long-term prognosis is for us to determine. The whole world has a love affair with our national parks. What a neat thing we have. The whole world has a love affair with our public land system. Some pretty visionary people made some really controversial decisions a long time ago to set aside public lands. And in a place like Montana, it takes that integration of public and private lands to have the wildlife that we have. What a cool thing. We live in a state where you can drive down the interstate and you can see lots of wildlife at 80 miles an hour. Not very many places in this country can you do that. And it's because of that system of public and private lands. It's because of this system that includes national parks as islands in a sea of people and other things in our environment, whether it's roads, trains, what have you. It takes all of that, you know, and it's up to us to figure out how to piece that together. Montana truly is a working landscape. 90 to 95% of the wolf population in Montana lives outside of national parks. That's what makes it a work in progress, and we got to figure that out.
Yes, sir.
My question is to Carolyn. Carolyn, in defense of Carolyn, I've asked her to send me information, and she's sent me volumes of information, and it's always been very timely. I thank you for that. Becky, thank you for what you're trying to do. But my question to Carolyn is, why, and it's not meant to incite you, but why should we trust the agency that you represent when, in the past, Judge Malloy has overruled what your agency has said was okay to do? Can you give me an explanation on why, in your opinion, Judge Malloy would make a decision like that and overrule your agency? And why should we trust you to make, why would he overrule the decisions that your agency made to take the wolves off the ESA and delist them and expedite a hunt that you're going to do now?
With all due respect to your question, I will defer any speculation about Judge Malloy, why he does things or why he doesn't do things. Our country has a legal system that allows people to challenge decisions by the federal government. What a great thing. On the other hand, the decisions that are made in the court system are largely driven by the rule of law. Not our frustrations about wolves, or not our value systems about wolves, they're driven by the rule of law.
So what are your decisions driven by? Political pressure?
No. Come spend a day in my office. You're welcome anytime.
So I think I might just chime in a bit. I would say that, on the surface, one of the differences between the original, so let's say last year's Montana Wolf Plan and this year's Montana Wolf Plan, is that it's kind of taken into account that some of the comments from last year and come up with less wolf to be harvested. So, I don't want to, I think Carolyn's point about, mind reading judges' minds. If we could do that, we'd all be lawyers in LA making tons of money. So, that can only go so far. Maybe we wouldn't be, but you get my point, right? So I think, from a strictly biological perspective, that would be my interpretation of the biology behind it.
Actually, let me come back to your thoughts about trust.
Sure.
And again, I appreciate the spirit of the question. You shouldn't necessarily trust us, but you should involve yourselves in the process in constructive ways.
You do.
Come to the meetings, come comment, come
The
participate.
meetings are always on short notice. The meetings that I see, that I find out about, are very short notice.
Oh, yeah,
If they were longer, Carolyn, if a couple weeks out, I could arrange my schedule, I could go to these things, I would go to these things. But there's such short notice, I don't know.
Yeah, so the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Commission meetings, they're the policy oversight board for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. You happen to live in a state that has an incredible constitution, clean and healthful environment, the right to participate in the decisions by your state government, the right to know. Those are powerful, powerful things that entitle you as citizens to know what's going on and to participate in what's going on. We have to announce meetings 2 weeks in advance. That's a requirement. So am I going to call you personally? Probably not. Are we going to put it on the internet? Absolutely. So put a bookmark on the FWP website. Put a bookmark on the commission meetings.
Sir.
Yeah, my name's Sterling Miller. I'm a wildlife biologist, and I have a question that I'd like to address to Mark. The main problem, that's not a problem, but as Carolyn has pointed out, the real blessing that we all have is we live in a democracy, and a democracy is subject to the will of the people at various levels. And when I look down the road a little bit at the problems facing wolf recovery, we focus today almost exclusively on the problems with livestock owners and stockholders. But really, my background in Alaska that you know about and so forth suggests that one of the biggest threats to a public consensus that is supportive of wolf recovery comes from hunters. And I think there's a huge disconnect between the reality of what we know about the impacts of predation on ungulates and the reality. And I'm just wondering if you could try to clarify a little bit what you are aware of, the science about the impact of predation on ungulate abundance.
Yeah, no, very good question, Sterling. And I think that it is the sort of 800-pound gorilla in the room, and sort of basically drives my career. I've studied wolf and elk population dynamics in dozens of different places as much as I can for the last 15 or 20 years. And it really is at, I think, the core of basically a classic competition between two predators, really. Humans who are competing with wolves and other predators for large ungulate prey. And so I guess the analogy I would sort of come back to is my answer to I get asked this question a lot. So are wolves capable of regulating elk to low density? And I use the term regulate in a very specific sense, but we can talk about it later. But can wolves regulate elk to low densities? And I would say that my answer to that question is sometimes yes and sometimes no, and it depends on a bunch of different environmental conditions, right? So I worked in Banff National Park where we saw wolves recolonize in 1986. About the same time they recolonized the North Fork of the Flathead at Pike Glacier. And at that time there was 1,000 elk distributed evenly throughout the valley. Last year's elk survey we counted 42 elk in the valley, and they all live in town now. So there's been a big shift in the distribution, so the behavior changes. But is it behavior? Actually, our studies show no, it's not behavior, it's just elk dying. So elk die, right? And in that system, which is very low primary productivity, lots of bad snow, bad place to be an elk basically, the answer to the question, can wolves reduce elk, I would say is yes, by somewhere in the order of 50% at least, if not more. So you come down to Yellowstone, you ask the same question. Well, are wolves really why there's elk down to 6,000 to 7,000, or why there's 6,000 or 7,000 out there? And wolves, I think you have to, as a logical person, sort of come to the deduction that wolves have something to do with it, right? Wolves are a predator, they eat lots of elk, you can do the math and figure it out. Now, are they the only thing? And so the analogy I use there is, do you blame the last person who's just stepped on your boat that caused it to sink? So the last person that got in the boat weighs 5 pounds. The first person that got in the boat weighs 500 pounds. And so the combined weight sinks the boat. So clearly it was the last person who got on the boat, right? So that's an inferential causation chain, which is obviously wrong in that case. So wolves have just been the last predator to join the Yellowstone buffet table, on top of humans and probably most notably grizzly bears. Grizzly bear recovery in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and studies on elk calves, 90% of the calf mortality is grizzly bears. So, it becomes a bit more tough to answer the question there. Yes, do wolves cause declines of elk in a really cause and effect way? And so, basically that summarizes the part of the answer, which is it varies. Now, the part of the answer, which what do we do about it? I think we look forward to a future very similar to the Alaskan sort of story, where we've got 70 years, though, of people just used to managing ungulates in the absence of predation. And when you add predators, and Doug would be the first one to add it in Yellowstone to say this, and he's a good friend of mine, is that you will get less elk. It's a de facto situation. And so if you think about how elk are managed, and Carolyn and I have talked about this a lot, and I think people in this room, one of the most effective things you can do is engage not in courtrooms, but at Fish and Wildlife Commissions, because how Fish and Wildlife sets their population objectives isn't really based on any science at all. So if you imagine elk over the last 30, 40 years, elk, there was no wolves, wolves were removed. Elk increased, like in Yellowstone, bounced around for 16,000 in Yellowstone. Wolves have come back along with grizzly bears, higher cougar numbers, etc. And that population has declined. Now, maybe it's wolves, maybe it's not. But regardless, the feedback to that sort of way hunting is managed is people buy hunting permits. That goes back into a hunting revenue fund, and that money is what funds Carolyn and other people in the agency. You can say you don't like it or argue about it if you don't like it, but that's really the foundation of it. And when that federal money dries up, it'll go away. So now, as those revenues decline, a place like Colorado where 100% of its fish and wildlife budget comes from hunting tags, 70% of which are bull elk, right? You could see an immediate positive feedback between the concern over declining revenues, both by the fish and wildlife managers, right, and by the hunting public in some ways. And so I think that is absolutely where the conflict's going, but I don't think it will be resolved by science. And I say that because we go to Alaska, and after the Alaskan wolf controls of the 90s, right, and I know I'm rambling here, but after the wolf controls of the 90s, there was a National Academy of Press book published that's pretty much looked at, you know, this scientific question: do we have enough data to say whether wolves kill moose? And the answer was really kind of a sort of pathetic no, sort of like maybe not. We don't know. Since then, we've done a wolf study in Canada, wolf control, and the sheer scale of it, I think, is important here. So they did an area of 20,000 square kilometers. It's my favorite, I call it my favorite wolf control study because it's the best done, not because I like wolf control, but it's actually got controls and experiments and this and that. And they took a 20,000 square kilometer area. That's the size of Idaho, you know, over there. They killed all the wolves in it, about 200 a year for 3 years, right? Then they measured the responses of moose, caribou, and sheep. Caribou are declining. Moose, everybody in the Yukon needs a moose. And, you know, and there's value there. That's what people in Alaska and the Yukon want. They want moose. What did they find? They found that, well, you killed a lot of wolves. They killed 80% of the wolf population, right? Moose survival doubled. Moose calf survival doubled. Caribou calf survival doubled. Nothing else changed. So the answer to that story is yes, if you kill wolves, all of them, 80% of them, you get more ungulates. They stopped the control. Within a year and a half, wolf densities were back up to almost 70% pre-wolf control densities. So everything was back to normal. Wolves were all over the place. Moose densities, et cetera, were in the tank. So, you know, to me, the answer is, from that is, and if you talk over beers with a guy, Bob Hayes, he's like, it would have been cheaper to buy everybody in the Yukon a cow, right? And just ship it to the front door, cutting around. But, you know, it doesn't really matter, right? The science of wolf control, and that's where we're going, I think, in this part of the world, is this question of, can we manage wolves to achieve specific harvest objectives? And I would say, based on the science in Alaska, you know, it's pretty thin, eh? Like, it's going to be extremely expensive to do so, very controversial, and the answer to how to solve that question, I think, isn't necessarily in the courts. It's somehow getting involved with this sort of, and it's a social process, see, Canadian. So it's a social process that decides in a particular area how many elk are enough. And it's, you know, let's say Carolyn's the elk manager, somebody calling saying, get those elk off my buddy ranch, they're eating all my hay. And then a guide calling up and saying, well, there aren't enough elk in my particular favorite hunting unit, I would like more, please. And it's that sort of balancing act that goes back and forth. And I'm sort of paraphrasing a bit. There's a bit of science to this, but not much, actually. And so, you know, I think going to Fish and Wildlife Commission meetings would be, it's a riot, for one. I love it. It's always really fun. And I mean, I think that's sort of where the action's happening in some ways. And I think if we're coming to a consensus, at least some of us on the panel, that I think winning these battles in court, just don't do anything. And my last soapbox comment here is, as a Canadian, watching the level of polarization about wolves in this country is really quite staggering, and I think it's not helping. And for every action, there's an equal and positive reaction. Well, that's Idaho, whatever it is, the Idaho People for Wildlife who can't spell, you know, who have all this sort of action alerts about wolves killing their cows and everything. So anyway, I don't know if I answered your question, Sterling, but you got me started.
And I'll just add something, because hunting is a very contentious issue right now with the hearing and everything on Monday, and the signs posted on the corner with the little girl, you know, 6 years old, I want to help my daddy kill an elk one day. You know, I know there's competition. I mean, there's a lot more. I mean, hunters think there's a lot more competition than there really is here in Montana. But of course there's competition. Having wolves and other predators on the ground make ungulates move in different places. I mean, look what happened in Yellowstone. They're moving. They have a more natural rhythm now. They're moving to different places. They're not always in the same exact meadow that I've been holding my outfitting camp at for the last 20 years. No, you know, it's not all wolves that are doing that. It's drought, it's weather, it's development, it's, you know, whatever's going on in the landscape. But just, you know, I'm all about education and getting figures out there and just letting people know what's really going on. In Montana, we have the same amount of elk this year than we did last year. It hasn't went down. It hasn't went down. Wyoming increased 10,000 elk. You know, so there's plenty of elk out there. Doug Smith said that with everything in a wolf's favor, they could maybe kill 22 elk per year, one wolf, with everything in their favor. I mean, the consensus is about 1 in 5. 1 in 5 tries, they make a kill. So they could maybe kill 22 elk per year. Okay, so if you do the math in Montana and everything was in the wolf's favor, they could have killed 11,000 elk last year. That leaves 140,000 for hunters. Guess how much the average harvest is? 20,000. So there's plenty out there. They're just moving in different places. So it's not this, I want to help my daddy kill an elk one day because the wolves are killing them all, and if they get delisted, there's not going to be any elk. There are elk. You just have to look for them. They're more wild now, and they should be. They're not standing in somebody's front yard. You know, they're moving. They're in their native habitat where they need to be, and they're more healthy because they're being moved. The ecosystems are more healthy because they're not overgrazing. Look at the beginning of this film. It showed it right there. So, you know, that's just a little bit about Montana and where we are on our elk numbers. We're not low. And I mean, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks said the Treasure State hunters are going to expect a fine season. The populations are up. Idaho was asked, are we all out of elk? And they said, not even close. That's from Idaho Fish and Game. So I think there's a balance of education there of saying, you know, there are elk out there to be hunted. It might be a little bit more difficult to find them.
Hey, I'd like to have Nathan chime in here for a moment. Nathan, I know you're a PhD focused on wolf, elk, predator-prey dynamics, primarily in Northern Range there in Yellowstone, with a real focus on the landscape and how the landscape affects the wolf elk dynamics there. And we live in a place in Gardner. Nathan has been there a long time, almost his whole life, where there's a lot of concern that our economy is being hurt in the winter months because of the lack of late winter tags that are given out. Where we were once giving out over 2,000 late winter hunt tags. Well, what is it now? About
200 or 150,
200
something
tags.
like that.
So,
Yeah.
you know, that's a lot of revenue that's, we certainly have lost in Gardner, but I think a key buzzword to walk away here with this evening, touching upon both Renee, Mark, and Sterling here, is multi-causal. Whether you're talking about the wolves' impact on the elk from a hunting standpoint, people who think that wolves are solely wiping out the elk population, it's multi-causal. We've had harsh winters since the wolves returned, especially 97. We're experiencing drought. Not this year, but we've experienced a great deal of drought. We've got grizzly bears in the ecosystem who have recovered.
So I'd like to chime in though, because, and this is a little bit of a sore point, is that, like I published this paper, it showed wolves had strong trophic effects on ecosystems in Banff, right? Mm-hmm. And Nathan's done the same. Nathan, you see what you think in a minute of where I'm going. You can see where I'm going in this. Mm-hmm. So there's uncertainty in the effects of wolves on elk, right? And I just talked about that, and everybody in this room wants to hear that, right? You all want to hear that it's uncertain the effects of wolves on elk.
Okay, well, I'm going to add something
But it's uncertain the effects of wolves on trophic
Okay, and that's right where I'm going there, Mark.
Good.
Is it's also, I think that wolf advocates sometimes do wolves a disservice by putting wolves on such a pedestal that they are single-handedly affecting this huge trophic cascade in Yellowstone. Any kind of trophic cascade we're seeing in Yellowstone, although the wolves are certainly playing a key role, is also multi-causal. You can't give all the credit to one creditor, whether it's negative or whether it's positive. And so I'd be interested to hear what Nathan has to say in terms of the movements and how you think that may affect, on a landscape level, perhaps the number of wolves we see in Gardner.
I think Mark and Mike are both saying you don't get it both ways. I mean, you can't say that wolves are having this incredible effect on their ecosystems by limiting herbivores and causing the vegetation to grow without them actually limiting the herbivores. They have to eat them to do that. And so I think, we've gone into, and Mike referred to my studies with this idea, well, some people think they'll have an insignificant effect and some people think they'll have an overwhelming effect. And most of the ecological modeling theory and data that we can throw together as of like 5 years ago said, they'll have a significant effect, it will be moderate. Wolves will disappear before elk will disappear. Does that make sense? They live on elk and they won't get the last one. So, when it comes to these sort of trophic cascade ideas, you really can't have it both ways. I think Yellowstone suffers from 60 or 70 years of very, very high abundance of herbivores on their grasslands. And yeah, we saw some pictures here in the movie of how it's recovering, but I live and guide there. I'm here to tell you that's about 10% of the landscape. The rest of it is stuck in this state that the large abundance of herbivores caused for 60 or 70 years that isn't slow to change. And it may take 60 or 70 more years before it really is a transformed riparian environment in that place. So that's just one caution, and Mike talked about the disservice that we can do by saying, well, wolves are just, you know, these transformative forces. Well, it takes a long time, they need a lot of help. Sure, they're big ecosystem players, no doubt about that. The film really I felt did a good job of detailing, you know, what their long-term effects in these systems are. And if you really buy into the Leopold land ethic, which I think you need to in order to say, yeah, wolves are good because they create these landscapes that are self-sustaining and self-renewing, like Aldo Leopold once said. That's very cool. But Carolyn just told us we live on a landscape that's a working landscape. It's not a renewing landscape. This is like where people live and make their livings. So it's a hard argument to carry onto a working landscape that we need wolves for this healthy landscape. It's a hard transition to make. I mean, I think I'm up here to say, well, wolves are good economically too. You know, they're there because, you know, they're helping the tourism come into Yellowstone. Those are all very tangible arguments because it's all about, you know, almighty dollar, really. And I'm not saying, you know, that that's a bad argument to say when you're talking about national parks. Of course, we're trying to manage our national parks as places that have very healthy ecological processes. It's just when you get beyond those, it's not clear that that's what we're really going for out there.
I'd like to ask Mark a question here. I know some people probably still have some hunt-related questions, and you know, there's been a lot of talk that a hunt in Montana can encourage a, you know, more of a land ethic when it comes to managing wolves and more of an acceptance amongst hunters when they're helping to manage that population. My question for you would be, you know, a statement I recently read. If this is misquoted, you can go ahead and jump on me. But you said, in none of the places around the world where wolves are currently hunted, from the Ukraine to Alaska and Colorado, has a wolf hunter constituency been developed.
I don't think I said Colorado because there's no...
I didn't say Colorado, Canada, Alaska
all right.
and Canada.
Yeah, so the idea is kind of like the idea of cougar houndsmen, right? I mean, the biggest proponents in some ways in Montana of reducing cougar harvests are the very hunters of the cougars themselves, which might seem paradoxical to somebody who finds the prospect of treating a large cat and shooting it, you know, unethical or whatever. But it's that sort of same sort of argument that there's this sort of user group that benefits from the resource and then they advocate for the continuing hunt of that resource in a sustainable way. And I would say I don't think that it happened. I don't see the benefit. I haven't seen that anywhere in the world, right? Anywhere that wolves are currently harvested, there's not really an ethic amongst hunters. Amongst trappers, sometimes, but that's kind of also rare. I would say that I think across the whole world, the Montana and Idaho hunting plans are probably some of the most restrictive hunting plans that I know of, right? From a sheer hunting, how to manage a wolf hunt. For example, in Alberta, you can shoot a wolf anywhere, anytime, any place, except for 2 months in the summer, unless you're the friend, relative, or designee of a landowner that has cattle on their land, or public land where the cattle is and or within 8 miles of that. So you draw a map of that, and it's pretty much Alberta. And I'm a friend to everybody, and so I can hunt wolves everywhere, right? So, and so, you know, that's Alberta. BC, it's, you know, basically ad lib below, I think it's 800 meters anywhere in the province, and that's pretty much the only place wolves would want to live. Below 800 meters. So, you know, that's the Canadian sort of wolf harvest regulations. In the Northwest Territories, there's somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 wolves harvested a year out of a population of about 10,000 through any kinds of means of, you know, by, you know, snowmobile hunting, trapping, poisoning, etc. And you go around the world and you see much the same story. So now it doesn't create a sort of constituency that argues that, geez, we want more wolves because we really like hunting them. And I think it goes to discussing the mechanics of wolf hunting for a minute, because I think it has to do, and there is a bunch of swags in the sort of current wolf harvest plan. I think Carolyn would probably admit it. SWAG is a very scientific acronym for Scientific Wild Ass Guess, because we really don't know much about wolf harvests, right? We don't know, like, how many people here have seen a wolf? So how many of you could have shot
Outside of
it?
a national park, have you seen a wolf?
Outside of a national park. So how many of you could have shot it?
You mean physically?
Well, physically, like had you the gumption and stuff and guns and everything. So
Dad's backyard, 50 yards.
right, so there you go. So maybe 1 out of 50. I'll just summarize the statistics in that way. So so that's kind of the point. Actually, is we in terms of our the sort of data we've collected in Banff, where we've collared about 200 to 250 wolves over the last 10 or 15 years, that include lots of areas outside the parks where wolves are hunted. And a colleague study just nearby that collared another 150 wolves. Less than, I think, 6% of the mortality is due to human harvest from hunting, right? That's because it's hard. And it would be a great thing in the weekends, because we had all these debates in Canada about, oh my God, the elk population's tanking. Oh, we should go shoot wolves. And so, all the guys from Sundre would come out, which is basically like Shoto. They'd come to this beautiful little ranch I worked at that Nathan's been at, and they'd come wolf hunting for the weekend, and it would be a posse. And they'd be there, and they'd be drinking in the campground. The wolves would be running all around all night long. The morning would come, and they'd go out hunting wolves. And of course, the wolves were nowhere to be seen. It wouldn't have anything to do with that riffraff, right? But they just have that nice weekend out wolf hunting. And so, to me, wolf hunting is walking with a gun. And so, if any of you go walking with a gun, that's wolf hunting.
So was it just, comment to, the very first day that Idaho opened its wolf season, that morning, 2 wolves were killed. Was that just luck of the draw?
I think so. I think there's 2 things going on. So I published a paper that showed that wolves, with and without hunting, behave very differently. And we've had this conversation that I think the first few wolves post-delisting, it's probably worthwhile being a bit conservative, if this is going to be the way we go, because there's a lot of dumb wolves out there. And the analogy that I see is, and Nathan remembers this one wolf at the ranch I worked at. She was the alpha female of this one pack, but white. She was about 12 or 13 years old. No one saw her. She would be around the buildings all night, scavenging gut piles, around hunters, this and that. But she had lived, obviously, to be 12 or 13. And you could see it in the statistics of all the stuff we measured. She knew how to avoid humans. The park wolves that come out, la-di-da, right down the road in the middle of the daylight and get shot at, right? And that's, I think, the situation we're in right now. We've got, there is, I think, a predictable change in behavior that'll happen that reduces the perception of wolves being there, because fewer people will see them, et cetera, et cetera. It's just kind of based on our work in Banff. I'm not sure if it'll happen here, but it's pretty predictable. So 2, I don't know, how many have been harvested so far?
3.
3.
Oh, yeah, 3.
3. Well, I think there is, and it's from what I can tell of the management plans, that kind of learning is built into it, because we don't know how it could be. It could be
Speaking to the harvest, I'd ask Carolyn or anyone else on the panel, with wolves being such social critters and with them having such dynamic social structures, what is there a concern how this is going to affect those pack structures when you begin possibly taking out, say, an alpha male or an alpha female, and potentially that there could be an increase livestock depredation issue as we're taking wolves out of packs?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, ma'am.
So how about those wolves that die during the same part of the year due to other causes? Would you still ask me the same question about the breeder that gets hit by a car?
Or killed by other wolves. So.
What's the stats on that?
Well, so in protected populations, for example, Yellowstone or Denali or places like that, where you've got a relatively protected wolf population, about 20% of the annual mortality is other wolves killing each other, right? And so I think pardon me?
Bigger, Denali's bigger. But
Oh,
see,
yeah,
then
not
you add
really.
that plus management kills plus
Yeah.
hunting.
Well, no.
I think the question was to Michael.
Well, I think in the national parks, where we've lost, I think our northern range wolf herd, our wolf pack is down 40% this year. And I think there's probably many reasons for that, of which I certainly don't know all of them. I think there's definitely, I'm not the wolf expert that you are, but there's definitely, I think that challenges the social dynamics of that pack. We saw a wolf pack back down in the Hayden Valley, I want to say around 2004, took down a winter weekend bison. That winter weekend bison killed the alpha female sister, injured the alpha female and another animal in the pack in an interaction. And I think that certainly, I would imagine, must affect the social dynamics to some degree. And so I think outside of the park, it doesn't seem like there is as much wolf density. And again, I could be wrong on that, but it doesn't seem like there's as much inter-pack strife outside the park.
No, I think that's, I mean, I think, imagine the first wolves get to Yellowstone. What a great place to be, right? I mean, like, what a buffet table. My Canadian brother wolves were really happy, right? So then the populations increase. Elk are high, elk start to decline. We don't see interspecific competition in populations until the food starts to run out, right, basically. And we saw it in Banff about year 12 or 14. That's when the fighting got big at the dinner table. And I had 3 brothers growing up, so it was very similar when, the food was slim. And so I think, this concept of interspecific strife, that's what happens in natural populations. I think what you've mentioned is important on 2 topics, this concept of breeder loss, right? So you lose an alpha male or female in a pack. And there's certainly a really, an entrenched notion, and there's some evidence for it, that there's even culture associated with wolf packs. We see different wolf packs specialize on different prey species in some ways, like the Pelican Valley wolves, or we have this one wolf pack in northern Jasper that just basically eats sheep and goat all the time. So there is some, intangible, difficult to measure part of that loss of culture. But in terms of the breeder loss, we do know that there's a short-term, 1-year sort of, transient effect on population growth rate measured at the pack level. So what that means is, on average across the population, 10 of them might, 10 of 100 packs after the alpha male or female are killed might not be able to pull off having a pack the next year. And that affects the population, or litter, that affects the population growth rate of the whole population. So there is a potential effect there. And from an agricultural viewpoint, less is known about the effects of breeder loss on livestock depredation by wolves. I would say the study of livestock depredation by wolves is something I've never really wanted to get into, because it's really hard, right? And I think the kinds of work that we heard in the movie here today are exactly with the direction to go, but it's extremely difficult. But we do know with coyotes, this concept that sort of compensatory mortality, you kill a bunch of coyotes and the livestock depredation actually goes up the next year. We kind of have pretty reasonable evidence from that over big areas. We don't really know the mechanism on that either. So
that is well documented with coyotes, but this whole discussion, it started with a question of, do wolves regulate elk populations? Well, turn that on its head and ask, what's going to regulate wolf populations in a natural system? With coyotes and other carnivores, as far as I know, in natural systems, prey populations are what regulate predator populations.
Bingo.
So we have a not so natural system now. Are we as a society going to allow wolves to diminish only by allowing prey populations to pretty radically diminish? We're going to hit a few with cars, and right now we already have federal agents gunning wolves down. Wolves are going to die. How graceful are we going to be about how it happens?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, a large body of scientific evidence has documented the tremendous environmental damage that the livestock industry has on public lands in the American West. And it certainly seems that the majority of the conflict with wolves and bison has to do with the livestock industry. Should we as a society, I'll throw this out to the panel, should we as a society be thinking about phasing out public lands ranching in the American West? Public lands ranching in the American West.
Well, certainly a lot of people do think about that. Some take it seriously and some don't. And it raises a lot of important questions. But I guess I have a couple of responses to that. One is, let's just suppose we could agree as a society with a few ranchers in the minority. There's not that many of them. Forget it, you guys. It's all over. We're not going to do that anymore. Well, then what? How do we deal with hunters? How do we deal with the suburban interface? And then what other questions do we ask about our food supply? Yes, I know all the statistics about how Western ranchers only raise a tiny, tiny fraction of our beef supply, but what about the rest of our food supply? If we're going to ask ranchers to bear the brunt of this value shift, then what questions are we going to ask ourselves about what else we buy? About the Mississippi dead zone that's created by dumping nitrates all over the middle of the continent? Or what about allowing all sorts of agriculture to go on that destroys pollinator systems, which has all sorts of reverberations throughout ecosystems? I'm not defending ranchers per se and saying they're all ecologically perfect, because we all know they're not. But in fact, if we want agricultural practices to change, then ultimately it's consumers that have to take the responsibility for changing it. And then, of course, there's the whole other question of, you know, if we really didn't have ranchers on public lands, would that solve our problems? I mean, as Kim pointed out, increasingly wolves are on private lands, and I guess I don't really feel like we're going to fix our problems with agriculture by demonizing public lands ranchers. I think we're going to be more effective if we cultivate those who are really careful and really responsible.
I don't think I'm demonizing it. I'm just pointing out the fact that a large body of scientific evidence has identified livestock ranching on public lands in the American West as a huge, huge problem. It's one of the leading causes. I'm not demonizing. I'm just trying to state a fact. And it's public lands that are the common heritage of the American people. And it's a private industry. And there's a lot of, it seems like there's a lot of bending over backwards to accommodate the livestock industry. And we see it here with the wolf conflict, the bison conflict, and it just seems like maybe that's something that we can look at.
Well, I think some people are. I mean, to the defense of the idea, which isn't a bad one. I think organizations like World Wildlife Fund and other folks, Hank Fisher is now involved with World Wildlife Fund, is sort of spearheading this idea of trying to buy out specifically sort of risky leases.
The National Wildlife Federation.
Sorry, there we go. I know, see, I'm new to all these NGOs. I can't keep you guys straight in time. But I mean, I think there's certain value to sort of assessing risk in a spatial way and saying, well, you know, let's try and buy out that one. You know, and it's not the first example. Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep are declining, and one of the reasons is because of the, you know, disease transmission, and so they're being very strategic, buying out certain ranches. And I think you know, are buying out grazing leases on certain public land allotments. I mean, so I think there's certainly merit to the idea, but I do agree, and Carolyn's probably the one with data on it. You know, like what's the proportion of livestock depredation that occurs in public land?
Public to private.
In Montana, most of the livestock predation by wolves that's actually detected and confirmed is on private land, an overwhelming percentage. Detection, there's a detection bias there. Yeah. But I would follow up the thought by saying that in Montana, I would just reemphasize the point, we would not enjoy the wildlife and the open space that we have were it not for those private landowners holding that space and doing their best to take care of it. And we would do well as Montanans to remember that. And we would do well as Montanans to not argue about the little stuff. You know, I can show you a series of photographs. Anybody been to the Paradise Valley? You drive between Livingston and Gardner. How do I get a wolf from the east side to the west side in that valley today compared to 30 years ago? My phone would be ringing off the hook, folks. Think about the land. Think about the habitat. We can continue working on the rest, but I want you thinking about the land, because if we lose that land base for wildlife, you don't have the deer that the wolf needs to eat. You don't have the elk winter range where there's winter kill elk that bears scavenge on when they come out of the dens. You lose a lot more when you start compromising the land base in a place like Montana. And I think those are common values that we can build on, and the rest can be a work in progress.
I think in many, Kurt Hall, who works with Carolyn, who's a friend of mine, is the regional wildlife supervisor, Region 3, who would tell you that a wild landscape is dependent upon a working landscape. And I think there's certainly much to be
So I think I might chime in here. I mean, I think what Carolyn just said is kind of, you know, like policy, natural resource policy doesn't really offer us much advice sometimes about how to resolve these conflicts. But Carolyn just said the one piece of advice that actually does, and that's the search for common values between people with different sets of values or different sets of goals or different sorts of ethics or beliefs or whatever. And I think in my own experience, I went from I was arrested for old growth logging in northern Ontario, Tamagimi. I went from that to working in Banff, where wolves were getting run over on the highways and killed. That was the biggest source of mortality of wolves in Banff. And I went from that very sort of park-centric view of wolf ecology and wolf conservation. Then I moved to the Canadian equivalent of Shoto, right? And so it was a real change of venue, so to speak, and also a change in exposure to values and beliefs that were very different from mine. And the only way I personally found a way to exist and not lose my sanity in the grocery store trying to buy bananas while getting yelled at about being a wolf hippie, basically, was to try and identify, well, what were those core values that you and I have in the same? And that's one of the reasons I sit on sort of, environmental agency boards, and also the board of, here in Missoula of Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, because that is the foundation that, without elk, there would be no wolves. And I think, it sounds a bit hokey and quaint, but I think that's the starting point of trying to come to some resolution about contentious conflicts like wolves. It's not, as a Canadian in court, we just don't sue anybody in Canada. It's impolite. So, it's sort of through this kind of process, and when and it has, court cases have big effects on those kinds of working relationships, because so-and-so can't show up at so-and-so's meeting because they're in court together. Right? It sounds stupid, but these are human beings involved with these sorts of issues. And when somebody is a defendant and somebody is a plaintiff, they can't go to another meeting to have the kinds of conversations we're having today about trying to find, just brainstorming about these kinds of issues. So the sort of my criticism of natural resource policy science is that they really haven't given us much else except that. Seth probably, him and I can have the debate about it, but that's a really important lesson, I think.
So we're gonna field 3 final quick questions. I gotta get home and hear how Yo Gabba Gabba went with my baby on Nickelodeon. I know these folks have a drive ahead of them, so let's get 3 questions, and panel members, if we can get these a little shorter here, so we'll start here.
Well, my name is Carrie Hunt, and I'm the director of Wind River Bear Institute, and I just want to say that I agree with what I've just heard, and I was wanting to say this all along. I heard Becky ask for not having ranchers not be spoken to as assholes. I heard Kim say, give some compassion. I heard Mark and Carolyn say we need education. Well, I'm going to say this, that we've spent the past 15 years working with people on the ground, and you got to find common values, and it's so possible to make a difference if you get in there and you get to the person's house who hates bears, and you figure out, and you're working with him, listening and trying to help the guy get over whatever the problem is. And it's the same with the ranchers. If they're losing their cattle, losing their sheep, what do you do about it? We saw in the movie that is working, and it has worked for us. These dogs the guys that don't like bears, they love the fact we're chasing bears and getting them out of places. The guys that love bears, they love the fact that we're teaching bears to avoid, to respect boundaries, and we're saving them. There is common ground, and having spent 15 years recently trying to resolve human-bear conflict, and 15, 20 years before that working to figure out how to save bears, I'm telling you that that's the way to go. Get on the ground. Passing out brochures, doing it in court, it's not enough. You just can't do it that way. You've got to get in there and listen and work with these guys. She had the guts to do this. I haven't ever met her except we were on a Turner broadcast show together 15 years ago with Daryl Hannah handling my dogs and dealing with her sheep. But it's been a long haul. You said that people that are burnt out have gone on. I don't know why you're not in the business anymore, but I'm telling you, we're hanging on by a thread trying to save bears. It's time we quit fighting and we gotta get in there and listen and work together.
All right, we look forward to seeing you guys in Gardner on Saturday. Yes.
Yeah. I had a question, kind of more like a long-term or bigger vision question. At the court hearing on Monday, the lawyer for Montana FWP talked about how important it was to manage wolves, to take an ecosystem approach, basically, to wolf management. And we saw in this film, we saw that the wolves were preying in the Northern Rockies, the wolves were preying on elk, but they also brand bison. And so my question is, how can the state of Montana take an ecosystem approach to wolf management if we haze back all the buffalo or kill them as soon as they enter the state of Montana from Yellowstone Park?
So is this a question about bison management, or is this a question about elk and deer management?
Yeah, it's a question about how you can manage a whole ecosystem
I
that don't have bison.
I gotta insert myself here. FWP aren't the ones who are making the decision about how we manage bison. And in fact, it isn't even Montana ranchers that are making that decision. So, you know, you've raised a blatant contradiction, which is worrisome to a lot of people, but I don't really think FWP has control over that question. But it does relate back to what I said earlier, was that I think that the hostility that is currently being created by the hyperbole on the wolf stuff is definitely not helping on the bison front. And I can say that as a former member of the Board of Livestock. I would love to make progress on that front too, but in the current climate, it's really hard.
So I guess I still don't have an answer to my question, was how the state can say they're managing an entire ecosystem if bison are a natural part of that ecosystem and they're now being excluded in terms of being prey for wolves. I mean, maybe there isn't an answer.
I heard more of an opinion than a question, to be honest with you. I heard more of an opinion than a question. I think, though, the essence of what you're getting at is how is Montana going to approach management of mountain lions, wolves, black bears, grizzly bears, coyote, lynx, bobcat, fox, with deer, elk, moose, sheep, goat, domestic livestock. Is that what you're asking?
No, I guess I'm asking what the long-term, big picture vision of ecosystem management is for FWP if bison aren't playing a role in that, when they have been historically.
Well, I think I'll chime in, because you don't need to answer questions about bison. You're the wolf biologist. But, I think there is a long-term vision for bison being developed in a slow, sort of, perhaps too slow way. I think there's an active sort of movement to buy back grazing leases and sort of look at reasonable areas in eastern Montana that you could imagine having some sort of bison ecosystem, namely CMR. Right? And there's a couple projects ongoing at the university with grad students looking at some of the sort of minutia of it, like how bison eat grass and this and that sort of thing, and how they move around. But sort of moving towards a vision of one day, and I think it's a beautiful vision, imagining bison in eastern Montana, bison moving freely around CMR, doing what they did in places where bison were supposed to be. Like Yellowstone was the last place bison were found, right? It's not great bison habitat. Wood Buffalo National Park is also one of the last places bison were found. It's also not good bison habitat. But I think, given the sort of problems with Montana livestock and this and that, working towards that vision, imagining wolves in that isn't very tough, because the closest wolves are a couple 100 miles maybe from CMR at the most. Mm-hmm. And so, I think, the eradication of bison, took place over 30, 40, 50 years, and we've had no bison for 100 years. And so I think the sort of movement back to some sort of areas of really thinking about ecosystem management of bison that involved wolves, right? Would be really feasible to think of in a place like CMR or something like that. I think, bison in anything resembling the historic ecosystem management of bison in North America compared to what bison used to be, I think is kind of pie in the sky. We've got bison bones in Banff that show C3, C4 stable isotope ratios from Kansas, right? So that's the scale of bison ecology in North America. Migration over like tens of thousands of kilometers annually. And so, you know, if that's your vision of ecosystem management of bison, I think that's kind of tough to imagine. But, you know, some sort of reduced version of that, that's still more than we have now. I think there are people in Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks that used to be in Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks working for other organizations that are sort of pushing that vision. And I think there's a chance that you could imagine one day, like I've seen in wood buffalo, wolves attacking and killing bison somewhere out in eastern Montana.
So specific to maybe something FWP is doing on bison, Fish, Wildlife and Parks loves to tell a story about restoring wildlife, right? That's sort of the history of wildlife in Montana in this country. You shoot it for money, you kill it on purpose, and then you bring it back.
We call it the whack-a-mole school.
Yeah. So one of the things that Fish, Wildlife and Parks has been doing is developing and testing the capability to have disease-free bison in a quarantine facility as sources of animals to transplant and restore elsewhere. We're trying to figure out the technical aspects of the disease transmission to decrease the uncertainty of that which we don't fully understand relative to the disease brucellosis livestock and bison. My friend Mark here, we sort of think too about caribou. Wouldn't it be cool to restore mountain caribou in a place like Montana?
Be tough.
Technically, yeah. Technically, it would be a very, very difficult thing to do. But those are, yeah, those are some of the last two that we think about.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in keeping both the grizzly bear and the wolf federal, that's the only way the bills are going to get paid. I mean, you can argue about other things, but the truth is we need 300 million paying the bills for those two species, not 2 million in these three states. There's no way that these three states, after about year 2 or 3, will pay the bills adequately. If anybody thinks the money's going to be there from the states down the road away, hey, I got a bridge outside.
But there's a final statement. Let's have one final question here.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate all your guys' opinions. I'm a little disappointed I didn't hear anybody saying that they oppose the delisting. That would have been a nice perspective to hear us talk about, you know, just to get some more diversity of perspectives. But my question is, I guess I heard there's something about 500 wolves or so in Montana. Is there any concern that with the emotional charge of this, that people that are being granted tags, now that that is essentially being criminalized, will go beyond what is, given the 75 women kill or whatever, that people, because when I know the lady here said that there's certain attitudes here that we love the wolves, but a lot of the stuff I read in the Missouli and the people are commenting, they say wolves are bloodthirsty, they enjoy killing things just for the sport of it, they kill as much as possible, they're like the worst things ever. I know there are people out there with guns that now that they've been given the green light, they're just going to go to town, and I'm just wondering what kind of concerns people have. Do you feel that the things in place are effective enough to control people that are going to go out there and try to decimate, just from that standpoint?
You know,
Becky.
I think, yeah, I mean, a lot of people share your concern, and certainly there's plenty of rhetoric to bolster that concern. And I guess I have two responses. One is that if we were to try to set up an experiment with delisting that still allows us to have the Endangered Species Act safety net, this is it. Judge Malloy has this incredible opportunity to reject the injunction, allow delisting to go forward, but he can slap it right back at us if necessary. And anybody who says that's going to threaten the wolf as a species in the next 18 months or whatever the time would be is not really credible. So I realize that's very risky in a lot of people's minds, but I think it's worth thinking about. And I also think it's worth thinking about that rhetoric that concerns you so much and concerns me and a whole lot of other people. is only getting worse in the current climate. It's getting a lot worse.
And that's the reason I was expressing that question, is just seeing that escalation.
Yeah, and I've literally, one day I'm talking to Louisa Wilcox at NRDC, and the next day I'm talking to some really rabid anti-enviro ranchers in southwest Montana, and it's just like watching a ping pong match.
Yeah.
And, NRDC will say, oh my God, they sold 70,000 licenses in a day, and we have to do this because they're all going to be persecuted, and we're going to lose wolves all over again. And so then they have their announcement in the newspaper, and some guy in Dillon is on the phone saying, these guys are nuts. They have no, who do they think we are? And I guess I have to editorialize a little bit. When NRDC or Defenders of Wildlife or other groups send out these vast mailings that say, gunshots will reverberate throughout the Northern Rockies, and they have little pictures of wolf pups, and there are these, really radical statements about how the species is going to go extinct in a year, practically. It doesn't help their cause. And they're seen as fundraising machines, very cynical fundraising machines. And, I have a pretty direct quote from a very high-level person in one of those organizations who says, even when their own regional staff people say, look, you guys, cut down on the hyperbole, the people in the headquarters say things like, look, we got a formula that works, we're going to keep doing it. And that just feeds really destructive cynicism.
I would like to jump in on that because I guess I might sit up here as someone that sits on the fence with the delisting. And one of the biggest reasons I might be for it is because of the backlash that we're talking about here, as it sort of escalates the hatred for them. And I've heard people at the top levels of some of these organizations, like Defenders of Wildlife, say, either path we take is not so good for the wolves themselves. And I think they're in that sort of situation, and it's hard to get out of. So I am concerned about, things getting worse. At the same time, I agree with the other panelists that biologically wolves are doing very well, and we're not going to lose them after this hunting season. That's probably biologically true, in my opinion. I'm not a real fan of the way the hunt's going forward, actually. I guess to sum it up as a sort of a broadsword approach to a letter opener job kind of thing. And so I am concerned that, we need to work on how hunting in our state proceeds with wolves. And I'm not obviously anti-hunter. I was announced or introduced as a hunting person. So
You just drew a moose tag.
yes, and one of the great things about living in the state of Montana is after 25 years, you can finally draw a moose tag. But I'm concerned about hunting wolves right now because we haven't done it before, and it's just sort of, where are these 75 wolves going to die? And are we going to get to 75, or are we going to overshoot? And are we going to get it to 150 and 200 pretty quickly? It all depends on the hunter effort. I guess that topic's been addressed up here, and I guess none of us really know how much hunter effort there really be.
Well, I know this discussion could go on for much longer, but I want to thank the panel. You guys have been amazing. We appreciate it. I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to leave you guys with two quotes. One from Aldo Leopold. Definitely, I'm a big grizzly guy. Our work emphasizes, living in grizzly country. And one of the things that separates you as citizens of this region from any other citizens across the lower 48 is that you are ambassadors to a grizzly bear population, another predator, keystone species. And Aldo Leopold says that there seems to be a tacit assumption that if grizzlies survive in Alaska and Canada, it's good enough. But he said that's not good enough for me. Relegating grizzlies to Alaska is about like relegating happiness to heaven. One may never get there. And we certainly have something to be proud of in our conservation history, our legacy here. I think this is only going to encourage that to grow and evolve. But what separates us from Colorado is the fact that we got grizzly bears. Without grizzlies, we'd be just another Colorado. And we'll end it with a quote from Chief Seattle, who says, "What is man without the beasts? If all the beasts were gone, man would die from a great loneliness of spirit." I hope everybody has a safe travels home, and thank you.